So one thing we didn't talk about, because I was like, wow, we're 4 minutes ahead. Let's win this round. I didn't talk about when God showed up. So in the midst of Adam and Eve's shame, what does God do? It says they cover themselves because they're naked, and then God shows up. And what does Adam do? Adam hides. And God says, where are you? And we need to understand that God is asking, where are you? Not because he didn't know, but more like a parent playing hide and seek, like with the kids, you see the feet sticking out from underneath the drapes, like, where's Will? Where is William? Where is he? Like, he's inviting Adam and Eve to step out of hiding. He's inviting them to reveal themselves to him. He's inviting them to trust him. And that's the key. Remember, Catechism says, with this first fall, trust in God died in the human heart. And so here is Adam and Eve, and they're hiding. And finally, they see God, and they talk to God, and he says, I was naked because I was afraid, so I hid myself. I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid myself. And then God asks, who told you you were naked? You have eaten then of the fruit of the tree that I'd forbidden you to eat. And this, again, is so important for us to understand. Two things before we launch into the next thing. All of this is connected to our relationship with God. All of it is. And I've said this before, if you've heard this already, it's just a reminder. But how you and I hear those words of God will reveal almost everything we need to know about how we view God. When God says, who told you you were naked? You have eaten then of the fruit of the tree I'd forbidden you to eat. How we hear God's voice will tell us almost everything that we need to know about what our vision of God is. Because if we hear God's voice saying, who told you were naked? You have eaten then of the fruit of the tree I've forbidden you to eat. Like that anger, I'm so mad, I'm so upset, I'm so disappointed. Like I can't even stand to look at you right now. Sometimes that's how we hear God's voice. Sometimes that's how we imagine God would speak to us. Or, who told you you were naked? You hear God's heart breaking in his voice. You have eaten then of the fruit I'd forbidden you to eat. The text actually indicates that it's the second, not the first. Because the text goes on to say that here's God who immediately comes to their rescue. That he is not angry with Adam and Eve, but his heart is broken because he knows now this thing that we all know. He knows that's I know now the lie that's going to come against your heart. I know the lie that's going to come against your heart. He says, I know now, from now on, from this moment until the end of time, that love, you're made for love, you're still made for love, but love will always now involve sacrifice. And I know that it's going to hurt. So he says to the woman, you're going to have pain in childbirth. You're going to love this baby more than you'll love anything in your whole life, and it's going to hurt. And you'll learn in that love always involves sacrifice. To the man, he says, you're going to go off to work amid thorns and thistles, and you're going to get into your crappy car and have your horrible, crappy commute to your crappy cubicle, and you're going to learn, and now you're working, that love always involves sacrifice. Not because that's what I want for you, but that's what you're going to need to know. From now on, you're going to have to learn to love. And what you're going to learn is that love involves sacrifice. And it's remarkable because in that exact moment, that's when God, as you know this, that's when God promises that he, who is love, would come to us and he would also sacrifice. That he'd crush the head of the serpent, but that it would cost him something. Right? He will strike at you will crush his head while he strikes at your heel. So not only will God himself, who is love, come into this world and crush the head of the serpent, but it will cost him something. Because from this moment on, love involves sacrifice. But this is the truth. But God is on your side. Okay, pause. Any questions before we launch into the next thing? I will take a sip from my Bulldog Catholic brand tumbler. Go to merchology.bulldogcatholic. So, here's some principles we need to remember. That God, and then we need to explain these because I didn't necessarily explain them all. But here's the first principle of the TOB sheet. One is God is good. he made this world and you good and on purpose. So God is good, he made this world and you good and on purpose. Secondly, what is human being? Human beings, you are your body and soul. You are your body, therefore what you do with your body matters. Because of sin has broken the world. Sin has broken our relationship. It's broken our relationship in three ways. It's broken our relationship with God, it's broken our relationship with each other, and it's broken our relationship even in our own hearts. And we all know this. And even St. Paul says this. He says, why do I do what I don't want to do? Why am I not able to do what I do want to do? Who will save me from this wretched self? Praise be Jesus Christ. So here's Jesus who steps into this mess. This is amazing. Jesus steps into this mess. That's what we're going to pick up today. Right now. So Jesus steps into this mess and he comes along and he begins teaching. In fact, his first big sermon that we have in Matthew's gospel, it starts in chapter 5, goes to chapter 7. It's called the Sermon on the Mount. And I remember when I first read the Sermon on the Mount, like really read it as like a person like wanting to hear what does Jesus have to say about this world and me and all these things. I had gone to the Crow Wing County Fair, which is, as we all know, you guys, everyone knows that Minnesota State Fair is the best state fair in the country. Yes? Can I get an amen? Duh, of course it is. And we also know that Crow Wing County is the best county fair in the state. So therefore, I was at the best county fair in the world. And so the Crow Wing County Fair, at one point they were handing out these like little pocket Bibles. It was just New Testament, Proverbs, and Psalms. Little green things, and I was like, yes, I'll take one of those, And I'd never had a Bible before that I could, with words, I only had pictures. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to read the first book here. It was Matthew. And so Matthew is like, okay, here is Abraham, the father of Isaac, the father of Jacob. Like, okay, get past that. I got past the genealogy, and I finally got to like what I thought was like the meat, the heart of the thing, Matthew chapter 5. And in Matthew chapter 5, I'm like, what does Jesus have to teach? Let's go. And I was like 16 or 17 years old. And I was like, and Jesus says, what do you have in your notes? Jesus says, you've heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. I say to you, anyone who looks upon a person with adultery, with lust, commits adultery in their heart. And I was like, well, I'm toast. Like that was the thing. I remember being so discouraged because it was also, I heard it was, you should not kill, or not murder. I'm like, yeah, check, no problem. But any of you who grows angry with your brother, murders him in your heart. I'm like, well, you don't know my brother. Like he's... I remember when I first read these scriptures, I was just like, man, I can do the commandment thing. Like I can make sure I don't kill anyone. I can make sure I don't commit adultery. But Jesus is saying, like, yeah, I'm raising the standard even higher. And again, as a 16-year-old, 17-year-old, I'm really discouraged. And so John Paul II hears these things, and he asks the question, do these words frighten us? In your notes it says, are we to fear at the severity of these words, or rather have confidence in their salvific power? I'd be like, yeah, I'm afraid of these words. Because if this is Jesus, like, then again, I'm toast. Then I'm up a creek. Because here's the deal. I think we all probably all know ourselves. I know that, like, in my heart, there's something broken. And no amount of new rules is going to change that brokenness. I want to confess something, you guys. I have the heart of a speeder. So I see it says 30 miles an hour. And I'm like, thank you for the suggestion. And then it's just remarkable. It's just like one of those things like, yeah, I get it. It's 60. I think I can do better than that. In fact, I remember this one time, maybe you've heard this before. I was driving from Brainerd to Duluth on 210. And at 210 at the time, it was 55 miles an hour. And so I was driving along. I was trying to get back for daily mass. It was summertime. And I passed Aiken. And all of a sudden, woo! And I was like, oh, shoot. He pulled over to the side. And I'm just wearing shorts. Came from the lake, right? So I'm just like not dressed like a priest. And the guy walks up, state trooper. And he's like, you're speeding? I'm like, yeah. And he says, so where are you going? I'm saying, I'm going to Duluth. Oh, what are you in a hurry for? And I was like, I don't want to tell him for church. Because it'll sound like I'm... But I was like, church? Oh, really? I said, is he your pastor? Yeah, I'm a priest. He's like, oh, okay. And he takes my stuff and goes back to his car. After a few moments, he comes back to my car and he says, well, and I remember this line. It just stuck in my heart. He says, well, Father, the state's going to give you some grace today. And he just gave me a warning. And it wasn't even a written warning. It was the best warning. Oral, verbal warning, where I was like, no thing on my record. Like, this is, and I was like, are you serious? oh my gosh, thank you so much. And he's like, no problem, just keep it at the speed limit. And I go, oh, you bet, officer, And I pulled away, he got back to his car. I pulled away from the curb, or from the side, and got back on the road. And you guys, I was so grateful. I'm like 55 all the way home. We're doing this. I'm so grateful to this police officer because just that was it. I got grace today. And 10 minutes later, I was like that stupid police officer. Like, if he had only given me a ticket, then I could speed again. But now I'm stuck going 55 because he gave me grace. And I was like, because I have the heart of a speeder. We know this, you guys. And John Paul II even says this. He says, we know that laws in and of themselves don't change hearts. So my heart's not going to be changed because I got a new rule, because I got a new law. Jesus said, I came to give a new law. I'm like, well, shoot. Now I have to do this thing? Yeah, I give you a new law. You heard it was said, don't kill, but now I say, don't even get angry. You heard it was said, don't commit adultery. Now I say, don't lust. And John Paul II asks, so are we to fear the severity of those words? And if we're going to be honest, I think a lot of us would say, kind of, yeah. But this is where we have to ask the question, who is speaking those words? Like, who is it? Who is it who's telling us these words? Jesus, when he gives us this new law, we know that laws in and of themselves do not have the power to change hearts. But Jesus is pointing out, he does. And this is a part of this that is so important for us to understand, because God actually has the ability to change our hearts, not just give new rules. That's the next thing. Now, when it comes to a new heart, John Paul II used the term, and the term was ethos. So E-T-H-O-S. And the word ethos, I like it. I like heart. It's great. It's wonderful. But ethos is kind of unique. And how it's described to me is this. The ethos refers to it's in your notes, refers to one's inner world. What attracts us and what repels us. And that's just what we find ourselves in, right? We find ourselves naturally with a certain ethos. We find ourselves attracted to certain things and kind of repelled by other things. And that's very, very normal in us. But one of the realities we have is the fact that God came to change our ethos, right? God came to give us a new heart. And if we get that new heart, then we become what St. Paul says is we come from free from the law. Right? St. Paul says, those who are led by the Spirit are now free from the law. Now, when he says free from the law, he doesn't mean that there's no holds barred. Do whatever you want. But what he's saying is if you're led by the Spirit, then doing what you want, doing the right thing comes freely, comes naturally. The law is no longer restrictive, but it actually corresponds with your heart. So here's an example. Is anyone here married or engaged? Is your spouse here with you? Josh? Okay, good. You and Rachel? You guys married to each other? Great. Can you guys stand up? Okay, this is Josh and Rachel. Everyone say hi, Josh and Rachel. Hi. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so Josh, this question is really for you. It's Rachel's the prop. Sorry, Rachel. Josh, do you need the commandment? Sorry, I was going to ask this. Josh, do you desire to kill Rachel? No. Okay, great. Hey, for the record, he did not hesitate. It was right away. He said it. So no, right away. So therefore, Josh, do you need the commandment, thou shalt not kill your wife? No, because you don't even desire to do that thing, right? So here's the thing. There might be another couple here, we don't know, who need that commandment. But here, Josh is free from the commandment, right? Because he's free from the law because he doesn't even desire to break that law. Now, just for, I guess, equality's sake, Rachel, do you desire to kill Josh? No. Great, all right, awesome. So we're united on that. So you also don't need the commandment, thou shalt not kill your husband. Amen? Great, okay, you guys sit down. Well done, you guys. Yeah, go ahead. So that's the thing. It's like, so in this case, here's an occasion where they don't need the commandment because they're free from the desire to break the commandment. Now, we're going to talk about the brokenness, twistedness that we have in our heart. So when it comes to sexuality, but like we all know what it's like to experience freedom in some way or another. So Josh and Rachel know what it's like to experience freedom and not having a desire to kill their spouse. But I imagine a lot of us have it. Maybe you've experienced this kind of freedom. Maybe you've walked into a room that's empty and there's someone's phone sitting there. Or someone's wallet is sitting there. And suddenly you walk in and you're like, oh, someone's wallet, someone's phone. I wonder whose that is. And you have no desire to take it. Now, I'm not going to wait for a show of hands, but I'm guessing that a lot of us have had that experience where you walk into a room, no one's watching, no one's going to stop you, no one's going to know, but someone's going to know. No one's going to know. But you have no desire to take that wallet. You have no desire to go through the wallet and take out some money. You're free from the commandment, thou shalt not steal, because you don't even want to. But when our ethos is correct, we experience this incredible freedom. And this is what Jesus has come to do. The Theology of the Body highlights the fact that, yes, in the beginning it was not so. In the beginning we had this freedom. We were able to love each other and be loved. That's become twisted in our hearts, and now we desire... Well, I'll have to say this. Here's a question. We're made for love. Amen? Amen. What's the opposite of love? Hate. Opposite of love is hate. John Paul II would say that, while that's true, on a deeper sense, the opposite of love is not hate. He would say the opposite of love is use. It's that sense that, or I would say this, it's indifference or use. That rather than seeing the goodness of the other person and affirming their goodness, I'm indifferent. Or I see something desirable and I want to possess it. I want to use it for myself. So that's what we experience. John Paul II says, okay, but we all know also what it's like for that to be untwisted, and we don't want to use. We're not indifferent. We actually have the freedom to love. And so here's a quote in your notes. It says, in effect, Christ says, you've heard the command not to commit adultery. The problem is not the command. The problem is you desire to commit adultery. You've heard the command not to murder. The problem isn't the command not to murder. The problem is you desire to hurt or to use, to be indifferent, to murder. Then the next quote I think is so powerful. John Paul, he says, in Veritatis Splendor, he says, those bound by lust, and that might be a lot of us, those bound by lust, we experience God's law as a burden. So here I am, a 16-year-old, reading Matthew 5, which is the Sermon on the Mount. This is the most incredible talk ever given in the history of talks given. And I'm like, no. Why? Because I experienced God's law as a burden. Because why? Because I'm bound by lust. Because I think there's no other way of seeing a human being other than maybe the desire to either be indifferent to them or to use them. Goes on to say, as a restriction of their own freedom. On the other hand, this is incredible, those who are impelled by love feel an interior urge not to stop at the minimum demands of the law, but to live them in their fullness. Not to stop at the minimum demands of the law, but to live in their fullness. There's a book by a man named Philip Yancey, and Philip Yancey is a Protestant author. He has some really great books out there. At one point, he gives this example. He gives this description. He says, imagine here's a young couple. They get married, and they have gone through the ceremony, and they've done the reception, and now they've come back to the honeymoon or the newlywed suite, at the hotel, and they brush teeth or whatever they do, and they get into bed, and they're about to be intimate. And at one moment before they're about to consummate their marriage, the husband stops the wife and says, "Wait, just listen, honey, before we do this, before we give ourselves to each other in this love, I just want to ask you one question. I just want to clarify." As we move forward from tonight, I love you so much. I just want to know, how far can I go with other women and us be okay still? I love you. I just want to know, like what are the rules? What are the boundaries in the sense of where should I stop with other women and you're still okay? We're still okay. Yancey points it out and says, oh, that would ruin the night. That would kill the mood. Why? Because it says, as John Paul II says, here it says, those who are impelled by love, they feel an interior urge not to stop at the minimum demands of the law. Just like a husband would say, what's the minimum amount I can do for you? What's the maximum amount I can do with someone else? That's not love. Those who are impelled by love would say, I don't want to just reach the minimum. How do I actually live this love out? So, goes on to say, this is still an uncertain and fragile journey, as long as we're here on earth, but it's made possible by grace. It's made possible by grace. And this is the thing, that quote in text box, I think you have it here. Freedom from the law means not having a desire to break the law. Those compelled do not want to stop at the minimum demands of the law. And that's the goal. Like that's the dream. That's the dream. The dream for all of us is that actually would be impelled by love rather than simply restricted by the law. Jesus, or St. Paul, writes to the Romans and he says, "We groan inwardly as we await the redemption of our bodies." To me, is that what it means by that is a new heart, like a new ethos is possible. Now, at the same time, Christopher West points this out. He says at the same time, that can seem impossible. At the same time, you can say, like, I've never seen that, I've never experienced that. And he gives us an example of, imagine if all you've ever known of vehicles, all you've ever known of cars is cars with flat tires, with four flat tires. And that's all you've ever driven, that's all you've ever seen, is just cars. I don't know if you've ever tried driving a car with one flat tire. Imagine trying to drive a car with 4 flat tires. And you realize that it's so hard to turn, you can't go very fast, it's really rocky and really bumpy, you can't go over certain roads have to be perfect in order for you to even go down them, and it destroys the tires. And imagine someone comes along and they say, actually, I don't know if you know this, but in the beginning, people drove around with inflated tires. You're like, no. That doesn't happen. No, they used to be able to drive over the speed limit whenever they want. You could go on a corner at speed. You could go on rough roads. You could actually go off roads. Like, no, that's impossible. You wouldn't even be able to imagine what that would be like. But this is what Jesus is saying. In the beginning, it wasn't like this. You and I experienced a hardness of our heart. You and I experienced the desire to either be indifferent or to use people. But in the beginning, actually, you're made to love. In the beginning, love was actually something. The thing you're meant to be was also the thing you could do. And this is this truth that we need to, I think, if we can accept that, there is something really powerful about this. He says here, St. Paul, we groan inwardly as we wait for that. We groan inwardly as we wait for the redemption of our bodies. So we must accept the tension of already, God has given us the grace to do this, but not yet. I'm not yet ready to do this or able to do this. He goes on to say, in this life, we will always be able to recognize a system of forces at war within us, and victory is gradual. So what's it going to require? It's going to require grace and effort. That's what we're talking about right now. It's going to require grace and effort. St. Paul says, for freedom, Christ has set us free. So you're made for freedom. This whole new life, God has promised it to you. He actually gives you the ability to do it. Grace. What's grace? It says in your notes, grace is the free and undeserved gift that God gives to us to respond to our vocation, to become his adopted children. So again, God's power living inside of every one of us. You don't have to do it on your own. There's no such thing as white knuckle Christianity that lasts longer than a week. If you try the white knuckle Christianity, just let you know that I'm going to do this by myself. No such thing. It might last a day or 3. But Christianity is not about this. Christianity is about responding to God's free and undeserved gift. There's sanctifying grace, this is a technical term, and there's also actual grace that God gives us to help us conform our hearts and our lives to his will. And there's something about this. I just want to, if any of this ever gets really heavy, there's this note in John Paul II's work. It's a footnote in a document by John Paul II. So it's not even in the body of the text. It was something that he just kind of wrote as it almost seems like an afterthought. But he put it in there, and it's the kind of thing that, especially if you find yourself discouraged over your ethos, being like, this is not directed the right way, I don't know how I possibly could ever live this way. The John Paul II said, there are 3 indispensable and infallible means of grace. Let's pause on this for a second. 3 indispensable and infallible means of grace. He says indispensable in the sense that you can't do it without them. They're necessary. And infallible in the sense that they work every time. They cannot fail. They're infallible. So especially if you find this heavy, find it overwhelming, John Paul says, wait, you're not alone. You don't have to do this on your own. There are 3 indispensable, necessary, can't do without them, infallible, they'll never fail, means of grace. And they're very simple. Prayer, confession, and the Eucharist. These are 3 infallible and indispensable means of grace. That especially if you find yourself okay, I'm falling again. That's why, I love this, the first one of prayer. I don't know who it was who first said it, but I remember it stuck with me, and I go back to it many times in my life. He said this. He said, serious sin and serious prayer cannot coexist. One will kill the other. If you find yourself, you're the kind of person who finds himself in a place of like, man, I'm so discouraged because I come against this temptation and I keep falling. Okay, serious sin. But here's the thing, serious sin and serious prayer cannot coexist. At some point, one will kill the other. It might be a week, it might be a month, it could be 2 decades. But if you find yourself in a place where like, I can't overcome my serious sin, I have this weakness, okay. Rather than be discouraged, just simply make the commitment, I will never give up serious prayer. I'll simply never stop coming back to God for his help. So serious sin and serious prayer cannot coexist. One will kill the other. It's one of the indispensable, infallible means of grace. The second one is confession. And this is, again, Nick's line. He says, every one of us walking through this life, we're going to fall. But if you fall, when you fall into the confessional. That's it. Make it a symbol. I mean, God gave us, in Jesus, God gave us the sacrament of confession, not because he didn't want us to use it or didn't think we would need it, but because he knew we would need it and he wanted us to use it. It is one of the 3 infallible and indispensable means of grace. If you're going to fall into the confessional. And third, the Eucharist. Why? I mean, there's such a deep reality about this, especially when it comes to the body. I was thinking about this morning during Mass. I was like, wait a second, every single time the priest says, this is my body given for you, we're coming back to that truth that the flesh is the hinge of salvation. That God's grace comes to us in and through our bodies. And he gives us himself. If you went to Mass this morning, you saw God literally in the flesh. Truly in the flesh. If you had to receive Holy Communion, your body came into contact with his body. And you can't come into contact with fire without being transformed by it. And so these 3 indispensable, infallible means of grace, prayer, confession, and the Eucharist. Now, that's the grace. And there's all these other sources of grace too, scripture reading, other kinds of prayer. But also, we don't just need grace, we also need grit. And that's the second part here. Because a lot of times, I think we're like, well, if that's the grace, I'm just going to take the grace. And also, you know, when it comes to love, love shouldn't be difficult. I don't know how many times people will say things like that. It should be natural. Like, if you're going to love someone, it should be free-flowing. It should be spontaneous. And I understand that. Because why? Because I'm passionate. I love and I love this person. So I should just be able to love them without any training. And this is an example from Dr. Ted Sri. He used the example once. He said, what if you had a friend who had a passion for airplanes? Like if you go to the house, they have like in their bedroom, they have a bunch of like posters of airplanes. They have coffee table books of like all these other kind of airplanes going back. Here's what the first airplane looked like. Here's what the most recent airplane looked like. They know the difference between like a fixed wing and a movable, whatever. They know all the airplane things. They're passionate about airplanes. And they say, actually, they call you up on a Saturday morning and say, hey, there's a pilot that I know, and he said I could borrow his plane this morning to just try it. Do you want to fly with me? Like, how many of us would want to do this with someone, and you're like, no, you don't have any training in airplanes. Yeah, but I'm really passionate about it. Like, I love airplanes. Even though someone can be passionate about airplanes and love airplanes, you're not going to get up into it. You're not going to get in an airplane with them until they're what? Until they're trained in how to fly an airplane. If that's the case when it comes to flying, how much more serious would it be when it comes to love or life? Just because I'm passionate about a person, just because I'm passionate about, like, I want to love them or this relationship, doesn't mean that I'm actually able to. Doesn't mean I've actually been trained in love. I wouldn't get into a relationship with someone if they actually don't know how to love. John Paul II says, and John Paul Benedict II echoes him, and he says, if we're going to have that freedom, the freedom to truly love, it has to pass through the path of renunciation. What I mean by that is I have to have the ability to say no to myself. I have to discipline myself. And so how do I do that? Here's some practical things. How do I discipline my heart wants to either be indifferent or to use others. So what's discipline look like so I can be free? Here's one example. I really think that in so many ways, what comes into our heart passes through our eyes. What comes out of our heart passes through our actions. So what changes our heart comes through our eyes. And so if I'm going to actually love people differently, I have to look at people differently. This is part of the training. This is just this practical advice. If I want to love people differently, I have to look at people differently. And so, both men and women we're both broken, both twisted. Sometimes we're very similar in that twistedness. Sometimes we're somewhat different in that twistedness. So I'm going to paint in broad strokes, but know that if I say, oh, guys, it's like this, or girls, it's like this, it can be both for both, right? But guys, for one thing, if we want to transform our hearts, we want to change our ethos, one of the things we need to discipline is our eyes, or where we look, what we look at, what we attend to. So, example. At one point, my friend Nick, we were doing a confirmation retreat down in Pine City, Minnesota, and he'd given the guys' talk. And in the guys' talk, he had said, okay, boys, here's what we're going to do. When you talk to a woman, just look them in the eyes. Because he says, I work with a lot of women, and they're like, Nick, can you please tell the boys, like, we're up here, kind of a situation. And he's like, guys, you have to do this. So here they are. They're all, Nick's a very compelling speaker, so all these high school boys are like, yeah, we're going to do this. We're going to look them in the eyes. So the very next thing happens, they have a small group after this Nick's talk. Nick was leading a small group. He said in Pine City, there's this room that they're having a small group. They all had to sit on the floor because there's a bunch of 12 high school boys sitting on the floor. And there's a door here to the entryway of the church, and then in here was the body of the church. And that weekend, it was a Saturday, that weekend there was a wedding happening in the church. And so just as soon as Nick was going to say, so guys, what do you think about the talk? He said that, and then this door here burst open, and a young woman came in, who was part of the wedding, how would I say this? Her dress was both too high and too low at the same time. Does that make sense? It was both too low and too high at the same time. And so all these boys, and she came and she saw them and just walked right in between all of them to go to the other door. And they're on the floor. And he said, all the boys are like, and they like had this strain of like, eyes. And she walks out, and they're like, oh my gosh. And he's about to say, guys, that was great. And then she comes back. The door is on. She's like, okay, all the eyeballs. She walks out, and all the boys are like, oh my gosh, we did it. The eyeballs. Because that was the thing. It's like they're trained to look a certain way. And so they weren't looking that way. In fact, and they thought automatically that the girls would be like enamored by this. At one point at that lunch, some guys nodded in a small group, came up to him. He was hanging out. These boys came up. They just finished their lunch, sat down. Nick, we need to talk with you. He's like, yeah, what's going on? He said, okay, we just had lunch with some girls from our class. He's like, yeah, how'd it go? He's like, well, we looked them in the eyes the whole time. He said, yeah? And they didn't even do anything. What do you mean? Like, they didn't say thank you. They didn't he's like, what did you expect? This boy's looking me in the eyes. He's the one. It makes no sense. But the thing was that they were training themselves. Like, okay, I'm looking away. I want to see the person. That's the goal. Same thing is true with the women, right? So ladies might need to also look at the eyes. But no, whereas, again, broad strokes, whereas I think sometimes guys would objectify women's bodies, sometimes women objectify the idea of a guy. In the sense that you see that guy and they look that certain way and you're like, oh man, in 1.7 seconds you imagine what his name is, and you also know what your kids are going to be named, and you're going to have 2 little puppies, and they're going to have a little fence, and you have a house. I'm sure he likes puppies. Of course, you look at him. He looks like the kind of guy who likes dogs. He also probably wants 3 children. No, he wants a big family. He's Catholic. All these kind of that you kind of filled in all the gaps. And sometimes that's the way, and again, broad strokes, I'm just making fun. But there's a sense in which we both male and female, tend to objectify the other person. Sometimes it's objectifying their body, sometimes it's objectifying the idea of them. There was a story Christian West tells. I remember when I first heard him tell it, it just was so powerful to me. And it's this true story about 2 bishops. And these 2 bishops they were walking out of a church at one point together. And they were walking out of this church at the exact same moment that a very well-known prostitute was walking by. And we'll say that she was dressed for work. And you can imagine, this awkward situation where here's these bishops walking out of church, and here's this prostitute walking by. One of these bishops looked away. One of these bishops was like, yep, there's a prostitute. I'm looking away. When I was a kid, and we watched movies that had like questionable scenes, my mom would always say, ceiling scene. And we're like, okay. Just look away. Just look. Can we watch now? Can we watch now? Like, okay, fine. And it's not a bad thing. To have a ceiling scene, not a bad thing. To look away, not a bad thing. So here's a bishop who sees the woman, and like, nope, I got to look away. But then he looks over at his brother bishop. His name's Bishop Nonus. And he sees that this other bishop is staring right at this woman as she walks by. And he sees that he's staring, and he's like, Bishop, look away. What are you doing? And as Bishop Nonus turns his gaze away from this woman to look at his brother, Bishop, there's tears in his eyes. And he says, how tragic it is that such beauty has been sold to the lusts of men. Because when he saw her, he saw her. When he looked at her, he could see the person. And there's something good about this. And the point is, both bishops did the right thing. Because there's times in our lives where we just, nope, I got to look away. I know my heart, and I got to look away. But the goal is not look away. The goal is, I want to actually see the person who's right in front of me. The goal is to actually have trained my eyes so much that my heart actually is conformed to this. I'm not indifferent. I don't want to just simply use. That person is not for me to use. That person is for me to love. In fact, I remember talking with a man who, he was at, this is kind of a really long story, but I'll be as brief as possible. He was at a conference center to be part of a conference. And he walked into like an empty, if you've ever been into those empty like conference rooms where there's all the tables lined up and chairs on one side, and like there's candy in the dishes on the tables and things. So he walks into this room, it's empty, there's no one there. Walks to the window, and the window is overlooking like a beach of some sort. And he looked out the window, and he saw there a bunch of women, young women, out on the beach in suits. And he said, I stood there, and I was like, I shouldn't look, but he's like, and they can't see me. I'm not doing anything, just looking. And then he was like, okay, and he looked over at the table and saw that candy, and he was like, oh, I'm gonna have some candy. And this is the key point. He was gonna have some candy. He's like, oh, I can't take that candy. It's not mine. In that moment, he had this conviction he told me about later on. The conviction was, wait a second, I can't take that because that's not mine. And I can't take that because that's not mine. There's something about that that's just, that sense of I'm just gonna use. That's why it's really important for us to understand that what John Paul II points out is that we all have this desire, right? The ethos, this eros in us that is like, that wants to go out. But what happens when our heart's been twisted, it's like the power of a rocket that's been inverted. What I mean by that is the rocket has thrust, right? The whole has thrust to do what? To break through the atmosphere to go into outer space. It has that much power. So our eros, we'll talk about the next after lunch. Our eros is actually meant to go out, is meant to actually break free, go out of ourselves. But because our hearts have been twisted, that same amount of power that can break through the atmosphere is sometimes turned in on ourselves, and we can find ourselves doing horrible things and feeling like powerless to stop it because the rockets have been inverted, and now I just want to possess or I want to use. And yet, to affirm the dignity of a person, we'll talk about this again after lunch. To affirm the dignity of the person gets to be a choice. What I mean by that is, Nick talks about this in millisecond number 1 and millisecond number 2. Millisecond number 1 is when Nick first saw his wife, Jacelyn. He says they were at a party. It was a cast party for theater. They were both in theater. And he looked up and saw her face and was like, oh my gosh, like I want to marry her. Like he just immediately recognized her beauty. Immediately recognized that this woman is so beautiful. I want to get to know her. This woman is beautiful. I want to talk to her. Millisecond number 1. See, the fact is that every one of our hearts has something like that in us. That we're just, drawn to beauty. We're drawn to whatever's attractive because that's called ethos, right? We're drawn to these things. That's not bad. And we're not called to kill that desire. Millisecond number 1, recognizing beauty is amazing. It's that next sense, that next millisecond, the next movement. And the next movement is, do I recognize the beauty and say, wow, that exists for its own sake? Or do I use millisecond number 1 to say, oh, I'm going to take that, come here? Because millisecond number 1 just recognizes beauty. Millisecond number 2 can either say, yeah, that's beauty for your own sake. Bishop Nonis, look at this woman. What a tragedy it is that such beauty has been sold to the lusts of men because he saw her in millisecond number 2. Versus the guy in the conference center who millisecond number 2 was like, how much of that can I take in my mind? Now, the crazy thing is, the story goes on with the 2 bishops, that the woman walking by, her name was Pelagia, that she actually noticed. She kind of noticed bishops walking out of the church. And she had this, sense of shame. But she noticed the one bishop, she noticed Bishop Nonis looking at her. At first she was like, oh, okay, what? And then she realized she saw something in his eyes that she had never seen. Again, she's used to being used. She's used to being treated horribly. But she saw something in his eyes that was, wait a second, that's different. This is someone who sees something else when they look at me. And she asked, like, who is that bishop? They told her, he's Bishop Nonis, and so what she did is she actually went to wherever he lived, and he shared the gospel with her. She became a Christian, and Bishop Nonis is actually Saint Nonis, and she's actually Saint Pelagia. And it's this true story about the power of what a loving gaze can actually do. What a gaze that isn't indifferent and doesn't want to use another person can actually do it. It started this incredible journey of her to know that actually this man could look at me like this because this is how Jesus looks at me. Like this is how God looks at me. And this is possible for all of us to look. This is the last little piece of your notes. It says purity of hearts. It says, blessed are those who are pure of heart, for they shall see God. And here's the quote. It says, mature Christian purity affords the ability to see God's mystery revealed in the human body and a man and woman's call to communion. That all distilled down is purity of heart. Sometimes might mean ceiling scene, right? Purity of heart sometimes might mean look away. But ultimately, that's not the end. That's like, oh no, my ethos is I'm attracted to use, but I want that to be untwisted in such a way that now all I want to do, I just want to actually affirm this person. I just want to love them for their own sake. Not possess them, not use them, but simply affirm that they exist for their own sake. And actually, even protect them. Because that's the goal. I mean, right? Ultimately, remember Adam was put in the garden. Hey, cultivate, guard. And the people put in your life and my life, with our gaze, with our actions, we actually can guard if we see them as they are. But here's the thing. If we do this is the last little story. It's a little bit longer. If we do this, it doesn't always work out the way we want it to. If we do this, it sometimes is received as love and sometimes it's not. So I have a good friend, his name's Mark. And at one point, Mark graduated high school and he went off to Notre Dame in Indiana. And Mark says when he got to Indiana, when he got to Notre Dame, right away, the opening weekend, first weekend, he fell into this group of friends who were just great people, great people at Notre Dame. And in this little friend group was this woman that he was just completely infatuated with. Like he's just so taken by this woman. He thought she was the most beautiful, most funny, like super intelligent, all these things. He was done. He was over it. And so, as often as the friend group hung out, like Mark was there with this girl and he always wanted to ask her out, but couldn't get up the courage. At one point, it was homecoming weekend. And I don't know if you know this about Notre Dame, but they have a football team. And so there was a homecoming game and a homecoming dance afterwards. And so in the weeks leading up to this girl comes up to Mark and says, Mark, would you like to go to the game and dance with me? And Mark was like, yes, absolutely. This is like all my prayers, all my dreams, everything I've ever wanted answered right now. I should have asked her, but she asked me, amazing. So they go to the game, and here's something about Mark. Mark is he's one of the funniest people I've ever met. Like he's one of the, people who like can think of when nothing's funny, but he thinks of like the funniest thing you've ever heard in your life, like at the drop of a hat. He is that funny. So he is super charming the whole time, whole game. She's laughing at everything he's saying, like he's just laying it on. They go to the dance. She's loving it. At one point, she says, Mark, would you go get me something to drink? So, yeah, he goes off, he picks up, gets the 2 cups of punch or whatever it is, comes back across the gym to wherever she was supposed to be, but she's not there. And so he's kind of standing there like, okay, maybe she just wandered off. I don't know where she is. And these two glasses of punch, though, and he's kind of like walking around, does the lap of like, I don't really care, I'm supposed to be alone, kind of a situation. I have these 2 drinks for no reason. Ask the friends, like, could you see if she's in the bathroom right now? And they check, no, she's not there. And after a number of minutes, he realizes she left. Like, he thought they were having a great time, and she just sent him to get punch and then left the dance. And so Mark, puts the drinks down and he just left the dance too. He went back to his apartment. I always picture him doing the Charlie Brown walk across campus, And he gets back to his dorm, and he had a suite, so it was so you walk in, and there's a living room, kitchenette, and then it was 5 other guys. So 3 bedrooms, 2 guys each. And goes into his living room, and then opens the bedroom door, turns on the light, and he sees some clothes on the floor. And he hears, in his lofted bed up here, he hears this girl's voice, like, hey, Mark. He looks up, and there she is. And there are her clothes. And there she is in his bed. And oh my gosh, what is happening? And the only thing he could think of to say was, I got you punch. But you left. And she's like, yeah, I had such a good time tonight. And I just wanted to thank you. So I came back here. I want to thank you. And Mark said in that moment that he was like, oh my gosh, this is the girl of my dreams. This is the situation. I've never imagined this actually happening in a person's life. And he was like, and my youth group is 2,000 miles away. And my brothers are all 2,000 miles away. My parents, 2,000 miles away. My priest back home, 2,000 miles away. No one will ever know. I could hear she's in my bed. This girl I think is amazing. And no one's ever going to find out. And I could just do this. And they have confession tomorrow before Mass. And all the things going through his head. But then he was like, but I also stood there thinking, but no, he said, the words that I heard growing up, she's worth more than this. She's worth more than this. She's worth more than this. Went through his head. And he's like, I know I could get away with this, but she's worth more than this. And so he summed up everything he had in him. And he just said, I'm really sorry. I like you so much, but you're worth more than this. And I like to spend the rest of the night with you if you want. And he picked up her clothes and put them in the, and shut the door and went back to the living room. And I imagine he's just oh my gosh, okay. And I always picture this. And I need to ask him if this is what he did. But I imagine him sitting on the couch going oh my gosh, I did it. I did it. I am the stuff of youth group stories from now until the end of time. I defended her honor, her dignity. I win. There's a sense of I battled the dragon. Here we go. And man, she must be so, she knows how much she's loved. This is awesome. She knows how much she's loved. And so pretty soon the door opens and she's standing there dressed and she comes out and he stands up to hey, we can go back to the dance. She walks right up to him and just doesn't even stop. She looks right him in the face and just right across the face. And she says, you're going to regret this. And she leaves. And he said, I was standing there with my face stinging and there's some tears. And I was just what in the world was that? What was that? She went back to the dance. He stayed there. She went back to the dance and I told everyone about this. And he was the big joke. That whole rest of the semester, rest of the year, that group of people, friends that he came into the cafeteria, they just there he is, lame loser. He said his 5 roommates, he said two of his roommates actually wouldn't talk to him the rest of the year. 2 roommates made fun of him the rest of the year. He said one roommate, the one he actually shared the room with, he was like, yeah, Mark, I get it. That was really nice and noble of you, but I would never have done that. That's stupid, man. He said that whenever he saw her in the hallway, and he'd pass her in the hallway, she would just stare daggers at him, just this look of just hatred. And he's just I just thought I was doing the right thing. What is wrong? He'd go home for the summer, come back. So the next 3 years, he would pass her in the hallway, but she wouldn't even look at him. That first year, just staring daggers, like hating him. The next 3 years, she wouldn't even look. It was like he didn't even exist. And he's just one of those things, whenever he saw her, just reminded of this moment, like, wait a second, I thought I was doing the right thing. They all graduate and years go by. And it's another homecoming weekend. And so he actually went back to Indiana for homecoming with his parents, and then the woman who's Melanie is now his wife. And at the time they were dating. And they're doing the tailgate thing before the game. And at one point he said, I looked up and I saw her, the girl, coming towards him. And he's like, and she was just as beautiful as ever. Like just, oh my gosh, this woman is just like overwhelmingly beautiful. And she's looking right at him. And she's walking right towards him. And he said, and next to her, walking with her, is this man who's like the size of a tree. He's walking with her. And as she gets close, she calls out, Mark. And she like runs to him, like throws her arms around him, gives us a massive hug. And like he's like hugging her back, like, okay, what's happening right now? And she's like, I was praying that you would be here. I needed to see you. He's like, oh, it's good to see you too. And she says, okay, I have to ask you, do you remember homecoming our freshman year? He's like, let me think. He's like, yeah, of course I do. She said, that night I was so mad at you. I was so mad at you because you told me that I was worth more than this. No one ever told me that. And all I could think of when you said you're worth more than this, I think of two things. One is all the other guys that I'd been with and thought that you were rejecting me. You said you're worth more than this, but I thought, oh, this means I'm not good enough for you. Thought of all the other guys and thought, well, I'm not good enough for them. I'm just not good enough. So you told me that I was worth more than this, but I felt worthless. She said, I hated you that whole year. Whenever I saw you, I was so mad at you because you told me I was worth more than this. She said that summer, though, we all went back home, and that summer she said, I actually encountered Jesus in a new way in my life. And I knew that what you had said was true. But the next 3 years, I was so ashamed that I couldn't even look at you. Because every time I saw you, I thought, I know it's true that I'm worth more than this, but I haven't lived like that. She says, but I need you to know this. I need you to know that from that night until my wedding night, whenever I get close to a situation like ours, I would hear your voice telling me that I am worth more than that. And so from that night until I married him, the man next to her, your words kept me going. And that's what Mark says, and that's when the tree stepped forward and stuck out a limb. And this man looked at Mark and he said, I've been waiting for this day. To be able to shake the hand of the man who fought for my bride and protected her when I wasn't there to fight for her or protect her. And this is the crazy thing. The crazy thing is our hearts get so twisted, our hearts get so broken, that for her, protection felt like rejection. I know this happens so often. That even in the best heart that just gets twisted, someone saying, hey, let me protect you, can be interpreted as you just don't want me. It's crazy, isn't it crazy that the words, you're worth more than this, can actually hit our hearts in such a way that says, you're not worth this for me. And yet that's what we're called to. Like we're called to actually see each other this way. Not just see each other this way, but actually protect each other, even when it feels like rejection. Remember, I hope you come back after lunch. But if you ever find yourself in that place where it's like, well, I've fallen in that area, I've messed up in this area, or I keep struggling in this area, remember, it's not just about discipline. It's not just about grit. Above all, it's about grace. And you have been given 3 indispensable and infallible means of grace. If you fall, just keep praying. If you fall into the confessional. And if you're on empty, come to Jesus in the Eucharist. After lunch, we'll talk about how we move forward, how we learn how to stop telling lies with our bodies and start living joy.